welcome everybody. I had actually not thought to talk today because I've been traveling this week and I'm quite tired. But it did feel like it would not be a bad thing to put down a marker for today and what happened today before the Supreme Court. And those of you who follow me on Twitter know that I have just tweeted about an hour ago saying that the Supreme Court has gone rogue and it is time for Congress to step up. And I will discuss some of the ways in which the Congress could do that. But let me explain what is on the table in this moment in history, because with the Supreme Court under these three justices that have been added by former President Donald Trump, they are unraveling the government that we have had since 1933, that liberal consensus government I've talked about, which made some assumptions about what the role of government is in American society. So under first FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who adjusted the economy to try and level the playing field, and then under Harry S. Truman, who was a Democrat who took over when FDR died in 1945, and then under Dwight Eisenhower, who's a Republican who takes office in 1953, and then under Kennedy, who wasn't the president very long, of course, and then under LBJ and into Nixon, Lyndon Baines Johnson was a Democrat, and into Nixon, who was a Republican, we had a group of people who believed that, first of all, that they should represent the majority, which was a huge portion of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, believed that our government had a role to play in American society, our federal government. So before that period, business people especially, but also religious conservatives and absolutely racists, tried to center the heart of our federal confederacy, our federal republic, in the states. And the reason for that is because states are very easily manipulated in terms of size. It's just, and I'm not casting aspersions on state legislators by any stretch of the imagination, but if you are trying to determine the outcome, say, of a business regulation or of where a bridge should go or of what rights people have, it's much easier to manipulate a smaller group of people who have a much smaller pool from which to draw information. And so by throwing the power of our federal government and of our republic into the states, what that enabled those people who supported that to do was to guarantee that business people did not have regulation and they could treat their workers however they wished, and that minorities did not have rights, especially in the southern and the western states. You know, sometimes we forget to put the West in this, but for all the fact we had Jim Crow laws in the American South, we had Juan Crow laws and discrimination against Asians and Asian Americans, and certainly indigenous Americans, primarily in the American West. So and then in addition to that, there were the traditionalists backed in this early period by fundamentalists who believed that any attempt to replace the system of a patriarchal family and of church-based charity as a means of social control was a blow not only at the stability of their families, but also at Christianity. So those groups came together to preserve the idea that the purpose of the government was to put control of the country in the states, despite the fact that there'd been a civil war over that, and that in 1868 we added to our Constitution the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which took that issue on deliberately and said you couldn't pass laws in states that created hierarchies of our citizens, that every American citizen, and it defined American citizens at a national level for the first time and made sure it included Black Americans. So no American citizen could be discriminated against at the state level. And then when, and this is 1868, and then when, of course, the southern states continued to write legislation that meant African Americans had to work for white people, couldn't talk back, couldn't own guns, or could be arrested for things like vagrancy. And then when somebody else paid their fines, a white person paid their fines, and you might have seen the word I almost used there, they then had to work off the cost of repaying those fines. So although it was not legally enslavement, it was pretty close to it for the people who were in it. So when that happened, it continued to happen after the passage of the 14th Amendment and its ratification by the states and inclusion in our fundamental Constitution, in 1870, the Congress created the Department of Justice to make sure that states couldn't pull crap like that. Now, that system fell apart beginning in about 1871. I've written a ton of books about how that happened. Primarily, it happened because very skillful people in the media and in lawmaking convinced voters that the government protecting Black rights was a form of socialism. And they argued that by saying that because it took tax money to, for example, to support the Department of Justice, that was a redistribution of wealth from white people to Black people. And that looped in racism, it looped in class fears, it looped in fears of immigrants, and that system that was in place by 1870 fell apart. That was the system that Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to overturn in 1933 with his New Deal for the American people. I'm going to give you a new deal, he says. The old deal hasn't worked very well. There's discrimination against Black Americans, which his wife cared very much about. He cared less about, but was not unconcerned. I've never really gotten a chance to write about the Democrats and FDR and all that, which, you know, someday if we get on the other side of this, I will be very happy to do, because that's really where my heart of interests is right now. But he was addressing the inequalities for people of color, but mostly what he was concerned about was the fact that employers and people with large amounts of capital had gotten so much power that, you know, basically in the 1920s, there was the GNP went way up, but all that money was going to people at the very top, and workers were getting really badly squeezed. We didn't have occupational safety. So if you lost your arm, you were just out of luck. We didn't have any kind of rules about how employers had to treat their workers. So in fact, there's a case where there are many cases I'm sure you've heard of, but the one that always sticks for me, and those of you who know this case will know why it sticks for me, is that in Arizona, an employer who was faced with the idea of unionization amongst his workers put them all on a bus and had the bus driven to the middle of the desert and pushed them out without water, and then had the bus leave. So they had to find their way back with no water from a desert, because he wanted to emphasize that their lives were on the line. There were no protections against that in 1932. So when the people elected FDR, he began to use the federal government to protect labor, to limit the things that business owners could do. And he really pushed the idea, first, of regulation of business, and second, of the construction of a basic social safety net, so that there was something in place if, for example, you lost your arm. We all think about the social, I shouldn't say we all, certainly most people, me, is I guess what I mean, think about the Social Security Act as being protection for elderly. And it certainly is, but it is also, if you read the law, primarily at first protection for the disabled and for widows and children, because in 1932 there were no protections for that. So if you were a mother with 4 little kids and your husband got caught in a reaper, for example, and died, you were out of luck unless a church or a family member or somebody would take you in. The Social Security Act was designed to create a basic system of support, not everything under the sun, but a basic system of support. And then as well, FDR took on the fact that the idea of private investment in infrastructure was great if you lived in the cities, because there was money to be made there. But if you lived in the Tennessee Valley, for example, you were out of luck, because nobody was going to make the effort to put electricity, for example, into the Tennessee Valley. So he and Congress created things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a harbinger for the government to get involved in infrastructure projects that didn't necessarily pay, but that guaranteed that people who lived in rural parts of the country weren't left in some backwater, that they were able to join Americans as a whole as the country theoretically moved forward. I've talked before about how FDR really didn't push nearly as hard as people like me think that he ought to have to include racial minorities and women in that expansion of the state. But I understand why he couldn't, because he was a Democrat. He had to get the racist Democrats on board. That was a problem that Eisenhower did not have when he takes office in 1953, because he's a Republican. He has Republicans on board in a way that they weren't for FDR. So he is able to get through, and it's not easy, things like the Civil Rights Act of 1957, still, I believe, the longest filibuster by Strom Thurmond in our history. As you know, all this is off the top of my head, so don't write that down and put it in your doctoral dissertation and then discover that it was the Civil Rights Act of 64 that was a longer filibuster. But the point is, Democrats, Southern Democrats, did not want that. Urban Democrats did. That's a very important distinction for historians. But for my purposes today, where I wanted to go with that was that Eisenhower begins to recognize that in order to protect civil rights, which is important to him not only because he cares about the soldiers who served with him and who died for American democracy in its fight against fascism, but also because he recognizes that communist governments like the USSR and China are thumbing their noses at America and going, yeah, tell me about democracy. You know, look at the way you're treating Black people and brown people and indigenous Americans. What's going on? So he makes sure that when he nominates a Chief Justice to the Supreme Court, he nominates a man who has been a governor of California, and that's Earl Warren. And I hesitated a bit there because it's worth doing a little bit of a side trip here and mentioning that this is the first time in our history that we have not had anybody on the Supreme Court who has held an elective office. Sandra Day O'Connor was the last one. And this idea that somehow our justices should all be law professors is really problematic, because obviously they don't care where the rest of the most of us are. Anyway, with the elevation of Earl Warren to the Supreme Court, to the Chief Justiceship of the Supreme Court, what Warren was above all else was a coalition builder. And shortly after he takes the seat in January of 1954, the Supreme Court hands down two major decisions. The one I want to focus on is the one everybody focuses on, not that the other one is not important. It's also a discrimination case, but is Brown versus Board of Education. And with Brown v. Board, the Supreme Court uses the 14th Amendment and that clause about the equal protection of the laws to say, no, Southern states cannot treat Black people like second-class citizens. At the time, that decision is only directed at the public schools, but of course, very shortly, it's going to be expanded. And from there on, the Supreme Court, under this concept of protecting rights in the states by using the 14th Amendment, is going to expand to protect, for example, voting, minority voting. And Congress is going to get on board and pass things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which the anniversary of which was yesterday, June 29th, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made it easier to register to vote and tried to protect the idea that all Americans are created equal and have a right that was articulated in our Declaration of Independence to consent to their government. That's the world that Americans have lived under since 1933. 90 years later, as of this term in the Supreme Court, we are on the verge of losing every vestige of that. So let me unpack how we got here and why today's decisions were even bigger in the scheme of things than the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which was itself huge, as you know, and I'm going to talk about Roe as well. But what happened was that, you can imagine, I mean, the thing about history is you don't always have to, sometimes people think it's really difficult, like, what's going to happen next. Think about this. Who didn't like this world? Who didn't like a world where business was regulated, where states couldn't discriminate against minorities or against religions, where the government didn't take tax dollars to build roads, for example, and where the government didn't take tax dollars to support, elderly people? Who doesn't like that, right? Who doesn't like that are business people who stand to gain from being able to run their businesses however they wish, throwing pollution into the environment, um, paying their workers starvation wages, all the conditions that they had before FDR started pushing back on that. FDR and the Democratic Congress started pushing back on that. And as early as 1937, they had articulated in what they called a conservative manifesto that you have never heard of, but it was there, and I'm writing about that, so you'll see more about that. But as early as 37, they said, this is crazy. This whole idea of using the government to protect people, that's not the way this country is supposed to work. We need to get rid of business regulation. We need to promote Christianity. We need to stop getting involved with the states. We need to protect states' rights, and we need to protect the idea of individual businesses running our infrastructure so that we don't have, it'll be way more cost effective, and it won't create, we won't have to pay taxes to do it. They articulate that as early as 1937. And most Americans are like, what are you guys smoking? Because we think this is great. We're the majority here, and we can work a hard day's work and get paid for it, and we don't have to worry about losing our fingers and having our employer say, here's a nice dinner for your fingers, good luck to you. And we have hope that our mothers aren't going to be eating out of trash cans, which is one of the things that prompted the Social Security Act. And we can drive on roads. I mean, in the lifetime of people in the area where I am, people who are alive today, there were not bridges or roads over some of the peninsulas here that there are now. And similarly, people who had been discriminated against by state law thought this system was great, especially as you got into the 1960s and the 1970s, and the Supreme Court began to defend women's rights and more generally the rights of minorities, sexual minorities, racial minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities. People who fall into those categories were like, this is great. It gives, for example, women a chance to get educations and to get, some semblance of at least a claim to equal pay, which came, quite late on this. So that minority recognized that they had a real problem. And part of their real problem was that even when they could get, for example, a conservative, somebody who thought like them, and they used the word conservative even though they were quite radical, they wanted to overturn this new system. Even when they got somebody like Harry Blackmun on the Supreme Court, who was nominated by Richard Nixon, he ends up writing the Roe v. Wade decision because he listens to people, he learns from people, and he's like, I get it now. I get it now. So they've got a real problem in that they can't push their ideas because most people, if they really think about it, recognize, for example, that while they personally might not ever have had to have an abortion or might not think they would ever have an abortion, that there are enough cases where where a termination is imperative to save a woman's life, to get her out of an abusive situation, to any of these areas. They understood when they actually opened their minds that there was a reason that the state should not be involved in those decisions. At the same time, they also could look, for example, at the fact that Isaac Woodard's eyes were put out by a white sheriff who then got off, and by the law, that the federal government had to protect the rights of Americans. End of discussion. So this is a real problem for those people who want to overturn that system, because every time they think maybe they're going to manage to get people behind their version, they lose. So, for example, they do try after FDR during the Truman Administration, and Truman is the first president, white president, to campaign in Harlem. They in '48. they try to get people to vote for them. And and when in fact they continue to vote for people who support this kind of a government, they recognize voting is not the answer. That what they really need to do is to create a closed system of people who are really indoctrinated to believe, either for religious reasons or economic reasons or traditionalist reasons, that their version of the world is the right one. And they begin in 1951 to articulate this vision through books like God and Man at Yale by William F. Buckley Jr. But by 1955, Buckley is running the National Review, has started the National Review, which in its inaugural issue says it will tell, and this is a quote, the violated businessman's side of the story, unquote. And in that, he also pushes hard on the idea that governmental protection of Black rights is socialism. And they really push that idea and managed in 1971 to articulate through a memo by Lewis Powell, whom Nixon is going to name to the Supreme Court, that that really people who believe like they do are very much in the minority, and they're going to need to create think tanks, they're going to have to create media, and they're going to have to work in the courts to take the country back to the 1920s. They need to work in the courts. And that's obviously what I want to focus on today. So what happens then is that they begin to argue that what the Supreme Court is doing by using the 14th Amendment to protect the rights of individuals in the states is what they call judicial activism. And their argument is this. Their argument is that because individuals did not vote on Brown versus Board, for example, and because Brown v. Board overturns state laws in places like Mississippi, the Supreme Court is overriding the will of voters in those states. But I'll tell you what I have not been able to reconcile, and those of you who have corresponded with me about legal issues have probably been, will laugh at this, because it really has got me intellectually tied in knots here. It is an intellectually unsustainable position to say that states have to make the rules, but then to say states can also decide who gets to vote. Either everybody has to vote in a state and then the state laws are in place, or you have to have a mechanism for state laws to be overridden by a majority, if in fact people are going to consent to the government under which they live. You cannot say states need to make the rules and then say states can also decide who gets to vote and still say you're a democracy. Those things are intellectually incompatible. They are logically incompatible. They are legally incompatible, and they are principled. They are incompatible on principle. So what they said was that the federal government can't step in and overturn state laws. That's judicial activism. And what they insisted was that we needed to replace Supreme Court justices with people they called originalists. And what they meant by that was that they wanted to replace the Supreme Court justices who had been appointed by both Republicans and Democrats. So this idea that somehow liberal meant left-wing Democrat is dead wrong. It was the majority of Americans, Democrats and Republicans, including, as I say, Richard Nixon, who's going to put Justice Harlan on the court. They wanted to replace those justices with originalists, with the idea that the originalists would stop judicial activism and say that nothing, that the government couldn't do anything that wasn't explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. All right, so what happens then is that Ronald Reagan nominates to the court Robert Bork. And that's a name that a lot of you will remember. And there's this whole legend on the right that Robert Bork got borked, as they say, that the left-wing Democrats came down on him and destroyed him. And he was such a bright guy, so all these things. That's not what happened. What happened is that Democrats and Republicans both turned on Bork because of how far out there he was. And then when, in fact, Reagan appointed his next Supreme Court Justice nominated the next Supreme Court Justice instead of Bork, Democrats got on board for him. The reason Bork was such an outlier is because Bork was an originalist who wanted to erase this government that I'm talking about, although he's not even as extreme as the people we've got now. He wanted to go back to that era before the Supreme Court used its power to use the 14th Amendment to protect individual rights. And listen to what Ted Kennedy said about Bork. He said, this is what historians do. They wake up in the morning and go to the congressional record. He said, Mr. Bork should be rejected by the Senate because he stands for an extremist view of the Constitution and the role of the Supreme Court that would have placed him outside the mainstream of American constitutional jurisprudence in the 1960s, let alone the 1980s. Listen to this, and see if it sounds familiar. Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, rogue police could break down citizens' doors in midnight raids, school children could not be taught about evolution, writers and artists would be censored at the whim of government, and I'm just thinking of the books coming out of the libraries there. Let me start that again. Writers and artists would be censored at the whim of government, and the doors of the federal courts would be shut on the fingers of millions of citizens for whom the judiciary is often the only protector of the individual rights that are at the heart of our democracy. He went on and said, America is a better and a freer nation than Robert Bork thinks. Yet, in the delicate balance of the Supreme Court, his rigid ideology will tip the scales of justice against the kind of country America is and ought to be. The damage that the president, and this was Reagan, will do through this nomination, if it is not rejected by the Senate, could live on far beyond his presidential term. And then he goes on to say Reagan's up to his neck in Iran-Contra and all kinds of stuff he wasn't supposed to be doing. We now know this. And he says that that anybody who is that tainted should not be able to turn so dramatically the direction of the court. All right. So what happens? What happens, of course, is that not only people like the Reagan politicians, but also lawyers who want to go back to that early period begin to organize in order to take over the courts. And they organize, I believe it's during the Reagan years. It's been a while since I've looked up the Federalist Society, but they organize as the Federalist Society and pre-approve a series of justices to be originalists and to go back to this idea of destroying the modern state. But here's the kicker. One of the key originalists to sit on the court is going to be Antonin Scalia. And what is astonishing about things like his Heller decision, which is the one that asserts for the first time in our history an individual right to own guns, what he does with that is he reveals that originalism is whatever they want it to be. In fact, because they can find and use bad history to find back in the colonial era anything they want to find. So originalism right off the bat is itself a political statement saying all we're going to do is we're going to tear everything that we've got here apart, and we're going to make up a reason that we found back in the colonial era to do that. So right off the construction of originalism, we have ourselves a problem. What has happened, of course, is that the Republicans have managed, in part through the manipulation of, I shouldn't call it the manipulation because it's the way our system has been set up, but because of the Electoral College Act, which means that presidents who do not win a majority of the popular vote can in fact take office, as George W. Bush did in 2000 and as Donald Trump did in 2016. What that has meant is that presidents who do not represent the will of the majority have appointed at this point 5 of our 9 chief justices. Now, a bit of a caveat there. George W. Bush's 2 Supreme Court justices came on in his second term when he was elected by the popular vote, but people like me look at that askance because that was in the middle of a war, and Americans tend not to turn on a president in the middle of a war. So he did not, and of course he became unpopular very quickly again after that. But at least the last 3, you can say, were appointed by a man who lost the popular vote by a significant amount, and we now know also had foreign support for his election, which itself is a big problem. All right, so now we have this court in place, and I personally am very interested these days in the timing of the positioning of Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court. Because now that we are learning more and more and more about what was in the works in the White House to try and overturn the election, the fact that they thrust her onto the court as quickly as they did is to me deeply problematic. All right, that's the background. Now let me tell you about what happened today. So it's worth knowing that the court generally operates, or is supposed to operate, on a concept called stare decisis, which literally means it will stand by previous decisions. That is what the Supreme Court justices who ruled against Roe versus Wade last week told senators at an individual level that they would honor, that they would stand by previous decisions. And the reason that we have that concept in the law is that you don't want your courts messing around with settled law, because that will change things very quickly. It's hard to plan in advance if you're a business. It's hard to make decisions if your law is going to change all the time. Think of countries that have coups all the time, and you can't do anything because you don't know if what you're doing today is going to be illegal tomorrow. And you see that, for example, right now in Viktor Orban's Hungary, where the laws were changed in such a way to force his opposition out of their companies, for example. And you also saw it in the reign of Russian-backed oligarchs in Ukraine, when the law was used to go after opponents of the regime. So they're supposed to not rock the boat. They do rock the boat on occasion. So, for example, with the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954, that overturned Plessy v. Ferguson's of 1896, the decision that said, yeah, segregation's cool, separate but equal, right? They overturned that. But when they overturned that, when the Supreme Court in the past has overturned previous decisions, they have done so to expand rights, not to contract them. And they have made a real effort at popular outreach to have the court, but also lawmakers out there explaining why they're making such a big change and trying to ease the transition so that people can, have a little bit like Brown versus Board of Education, with all deliberate speed, a terribly problematic phrase in that decision, but one that didn't say tomorrow, so that people could have some transition time, simply because it's hard to react to things, as you know. All right, so all of the Supreme Court justices who now make up the radical majority, the 6 of them who are overturning the government under which we've lived since 1933, promised they would not do this. They promised they would value the idea of leaving the law that was settled law alone. Now, people are like, well, they lied under oath. Can't we impeach them? First of all, sure, they could be impeached, but it doesn't matter because you didn't have the votes to convict them in the Senate. But they were very, very careful in the way they said things, first of all. They didn't say flat out, I will not do this. They said things like, I value these things. And second of all, it's not against a law to change your mind. So the idea that somehow the fact they lied under oath is actionable, I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I should say that as a warning there, but as a historian, I would be like, yeah, It's clear they were lying, but it's also clear that you really can't, under our system, go after that, and for good reasons, by the way. It should be okay to say, I changed my mind. And that's what I thought then. That's not what I think now, because otherwise we have a whole other host of problems, right? Anyway, so they said they would value the past, and what they have done instead is, in this brief term of the Supreme Court, overturned our government, overturned the system of government under which we have lived. And the Roe versus Wade decision was the first time in our history that the courts have taken away a right that Americans, and it is certainly Americans who have children, but it will completely rip whole Americans who have children who are who have the most at stake in an immediate challenge our lives kind of way. But that decision will absolutely rent tears throughout our entire country. This is about employment. This is about families. This is about food. This is about the entire way our society has operated now for 2 generations. And they just tore it up. And that is one of the things that you're seeing people sort of trying to plug all the holes, because there are so many of them. They simply said, this was wrongly decided, it's done. We have lived with it now for 50 years. And the extraordinary repercussions of this, not only in individual women's lives, which itself is horrific, but in our economy, in our social safety net, in any number of places, is truly unthinkable. I mean, when it was handed down, I just sat and rocked for an hour thinking, I just don't even know how to begin to grapple with this. Aside from the personal level, the attack on our society is mind-boggling. But that's not the end of it. As you know, I did one of these talks after the Dobbs decision came down, and I said, listen, this is not just about Roe versus Wade. It is about our system of government. And I said to you then, you need to be aware that there is another case out there that is in many ways even bigger, which is, and I'm sure I offended somebody by saying that. I do not mean to downplay at all the effect of the Dobbs decision on people who bear children. It is, as I say, unfathomable. But today's decision, West Virginia versus the EPA, head on took on not just the Supreme Court and what it has done to protect civil rights and workers and the majority of Americans since the 1950s. Today's decision took on the entire federal government that has overseen our society since 1933. What it said was that the Congress, and this is a legal theory that is based in the separation of powers. Congress cannot delegate its authority to another branch of government except on minor issues. And that caveat, except on minor issues, is there in part because the argument under which this lives is called the non-delegation doctrine. And taken at its most extreme, the non-delegation doctrine says you can't ever have one branch give its power to another branch. And since Congress makes the laws, it can't set up something like the Environmental Protection Agency and put it in the executive branch where it currently sits. You just can't do that. And when that doctrine first became talked about in a major way under George W. Bush, a lot of people pushed back and said that literally will end the country tomorrow, because if you say that, you are ripping out all of the agencies that have run this country since 1933, almost 100 years of the EPA, the OSHA, all of those agencies that Congress created and then established in the executive branch. If you end them tomorrow, how would you even operate? So the next step down from that is what the Supreme Court put forward today. And any of you who are interested in legal thought, and I am not a lawyer for the 1,000th time, but I care a lot about legal thought and the way it intersects with our democracy. That's my sweet spot right in there. And in his concurrence, Justice Gorsuch wrote a theory of what is known as the major problems piece of the non-delegation doctrine. And what he said is that it's probably okay for Congress to go ahead and delegate little stuff, but it cannot delegate major stuff. And the case at hand today was the EPA, the West Virginia versus the EPA, over a law that, by the way, the Biden administration backed off from and is not even on the books right now. They went out of their way to take this case. And what they said is that Congress cannot delegate to an agency anything that is major, that's a big deal. And what they're looking at is this law that was at stake required power plants to make adjustments for climate change. And it would have involved them changing the way they operate, essentially. And this was, to those 6 justices, a major thing, to have this EPA saying you've got to change the way you're doing business over there in order to clean up the air, in order to make sure we don't die of climate change. And they said you can't do that. And in terms of that doctrine, let me chase that down a little bit. One of the things that is eye-popping to me is that they don't define what is a major deal. So this whole idea of originalism, we're going to go back and we're going to do what the original founders did. In fact, did. In fact, Washington himself agreed with the idea of Congress doing this. So if you're going to go back to originalism, what we're doing now is originalism. Instead, they have invented a whole new doctrine, saying there's going to be this major questions doctrine that should be that Congress can't delegate. So the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, cannot make major changes to address climate change. And again, parameters around what a major doctrine is. So they have taken upon themselves, these 6 people, to say that in fact the government can't, provide us with clean air, despite the fact Congress passed a law called the Clean Air Act. Anyway, so what they did with this was to say that all this has to go to Congress. Again, this is not necessarily a bad doctrine. If you're trying to protect democracy, and I hope you follow with me here on the logic behind this, that's not necessarily a bad doctrine. Unless you've skewed Congress so it can't pass anything, which is where we are with today's Senate, because of the Senate filibuster, which says that senators can stop legislation simply by saying they're going to break it, so that you cannot get any laws through the Senate unless you have 60 votes. And the Republicans are simply saying, no, we're not going to vote for anything the Democrats want. So essentially the Supreme Court says, well, you got to take it to this group over here, which would make real sense for a democracy. But it's the place where they've already stacked the system so nothing can get through. So essentially they're saying, no, the federal government can't do anything to address climate change. And that's not, to my mind, the worst decision that came down today, or the worst sign that came down today. Another decision did not come down, but a very bad sign came out today. And that is, yes, somebody just mentioned the Koch brothers here. Again, who benefits from this? The people who benefit from this are the people who don't want government regulation. And not, by the way, just over climate change. This wipes out the EPA and also any government agency's ability to take on anything the Supreme Court declares a major question. What does that look like? I bet it's not going to be limited to climate change. The thing that really bothered me today is that the Supreme Court said it would hear a case under what is known as independent state legislatures doctrine. And considering the state of the Supreme Court, this has me deeply concerned. Let me explain to you what this is. In North Carolina, recently, the North Carolina legislature passed a gerrymander of the state that was so partisan and so extreme that the North Carolina Supreme Court said, you guys can't do this. You've gone too far. This isn't even in line with the state constitution. Like, this is nuts. I'm sorry, I paraphrase. They didn't actually say that. But they said, you can't do this. And the state legislature said, watch us, because under the US Constitution, states have the right to determine the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives, and the state legislatures are the ones who get to decide that. So the state legislatures, if they want to, they have authority under the Constitution to decide that they're going to elect the state the state legislature in my bathroom, if that's what they decide, because that's what it is under the U.S. Constitution. Now, that's always in the past been interpreted as, you guys handle the paperwork here so that we can all have a decent say. But extreme right-wing Republicans in places like North Carolina, who took power in 2010 thanks to the Operation Red Map by the Republicans, are saying that they have the rights as state legislatures to decide how elections will be held. The Supreme Court has said, yeah, we'll hear that case. And recently, 3 of the justices, I believe it was Alito and Gorsuch, Alito, Gorsuch, and Thomas, said they agree with this. States can do whatever they want. And of course, thanks to the gutting of the Voting Rights Act under Shelby v. Holder in 2013, the federal government no longer has the teeth to go in and protect voting rights. If this doctrine, the independent state legislature's doctrine, is upheld by the Supreme Court, the Democrats will no longer be able not only to win at state levels, but also at the federal level. Because think about what this looks like in a presidential election. Think about what this looks like in a presidential election. If they can determine everything about the way an election is held, as Donald Trump wanted them to do in Georgia, in Arizona, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, then Republicans will win key states like Texas, like Florida, like Georgia, all 3 of which are vital to a presidential election. And they will be able to impose their will not only on their states, but also on the federal government. We will have radical minority control of this government. If the court decides to uphold the independent state legislature's doctrine. And as I say, 3 of them have said that they are willing to do that. Okay, so if you follow me on Twitter, you know that I think I said this earlier in this broadcast, that this is a constitutional crisis. Not just Roe, not just West Virginia versus EPA, not just independent state legislature's doctrine, not just the Shin decision, which said that you could not, if badly represented at the state level and found guilty of murder and thus liable for execution, you could not go to the federal government to introduce new evidence. That if the state said you were going to die, you were going to die even if you were not guilty, and could prove you were not guilty at the federal level. It is not just the imposition yesterday of regulations on unprecedented oversight of indigenous reservations. It is not just the fact that the Supreme Court found in their version of originalism completely ahistorical reasons to strike down New York state gun law and to strike down Roe versus Wade. It is that if they are allowed to do this, we will lose our democracy. That's why this is a constitutional crisis, and that's why people like me, and as you know, I'm a Libra, right? I tend to be really like, well, we could do this, well, we could do this. That's why I just broke the glass today and said this is a full-on emergency if we're going to protect our democracy. Okay, so now what do? Right? That's easy for me to say. As you know, I believe the way you change the direction of this country is through changing the way we talk about things, changing the language. I know it sounds like that's stupid, and you don't have to agree. Other people say that's wrong. That's what I study. And I will tell you, you can see, for example, in the fact that the radical right works so hard to control information and to control language and to control our access to information, just how effective it is. They are winning this battle because they have managed to convince voters of things that are lies because they say them repeatedly. They are not challenged on that. So first of all, what my role in this is to do things like this and say to people, you may not think you care about West Virginia versus the EPA, but you definitely are going to be concerned about other things that come down the pike. You might not think you care about a woman's right to choose whether or not to terminate a pregnancy, but just wait till they come for contraception and for gay marriage and possibly even, although it was decided a little bit differently, under interracial marriage. What we are looking at is not just a decision or two. We are looking at a historical moment in which a radical Supreme Court that was appointed, the majority of which, the swing votes were appointed by a man who is on record as trying to destroy our democracy, are dismantling the government under which we have lived for almost 100 years. So language is, of course, important, and talking to people is important. Not just listening to people like me, but talking to your friends and writing to people, not just like me, because I get a lot of mail, but to media figures, to your elected representatives from dog catcher through to the president, and of course to vote. Okay, those are all out there. To support organizations that are in this fight already, the Brennan Center, the NAACP Legal Fund, Mark Elias, any number of the places that are supporting the idea of restoring democracy, especially at the local level. I've also suggested that people do go to local meetings and to report to their friends, perhaps even in writing on Facebook or on Substack, what's happening at the local level. Is somebody coming into your school board meetings and screaming about critical race theory who doesn't even live in the town? Tell people that. But all that being said, there are things that we can do about a court that has run amok. And people have asked me, has there ever been a case like this before? Yes. There was a case of a court, the Melville Fuller Court of the late 19th century, that gave us the Plessy v. Ferguson decision and gave us laws that said you can't regulate business, gave us laws that said we can't have an income tax, gave us all kinds of things. And they were greeted at the time among ordinary people with horror, but at the time it was also not a huge government to dismantle the way that today's court is doing. That being said, the Fuller Court has been overruled in almost all of its decisions, with the exception of the insular cases, which gave us the idea of American territories and people who are non-citizen nationals. I'm still hot under the collar about that one. But my point is that their decisions did not stand, in part because there was such an extraordinary backlash against them. People coming out and saying, hey, wait on a minute here. And crucially, getting politicians on board, getting new politicians, getting people who would stand up and say, no, you can't do this. This is not the way America is supposed to look, not on little issues, but on big ones. We can agree on democracy. We can agree on the idea that everybody should have a vote. We should agree on the idea that we should all be equal before the law. Those are things to hammer on. There are things as well that Congress can do about this Supreme Court itself. And you all hear, we got to add more people to the court. I do believe that as a systemic matter, we need to do that. The court, there's way more business right now than the court can handle, and I do think it should be expanded to reflect the number of districts we have. It was the number of Supreme Court justices was set in 1869. The country was a lot smaller in 1869 than it is now. Now we have 13 districts. I would see that expanded. That being said, I am one of those people who thinks expanding the court now is going to create enormous instability, because all the people who like what the court is doing, and all the who are heavily armed, by the way, and all the people who fund the current court, because the court is operating on dark money in a huge way, are going to come out and say anything this court does now is illegitimate. What Congress can do, though, is a number of things. One of the ones that I've been playing with all morning is that the court took upon itself in 1803 the right to review laws. It was never granted that. If you read the Constitution, it says very, very little about what the court is supposed to do. I always joke when I teach it that first they set up the Congress and they do every little comma over what the Congress is supposed to do. And then they set up the executive and they work really hard on that too. And then they get to the courts and you're like, yeah, whatever, just make us some courts. Congress can take away the right of judicial review. It could say that the laws stand unless a majority, more than a majority of the Supreme Court overturns them. It could come up with a system for overruling a majority, a Supreme Court decision. Congress has the ability to decide what the role of the Supreme Court is in this country. And in the past, with a few exceptions, the court has worked very hard, as I say, to promote stability and to make sure we have continuity of laws. This is the first time in our history that we have a radical minority running the Supreme Court and having gone rogue, literally trying to destroy the government that the majority of us want to live under. And this is itself a constitutional crisis. And I am going to urge you to call on Congress and your state lawmakers to protect the right of everyone to vote and to curtail the ability of the Supreme Court literally to destroy our government, because this is not a normal Supreme Court. This is a radical minority Supreme Court that has thrown overboard the idea of leaving standing law standing, and is now dismantling our federal government, the federal government that protects our rights to clean air and laws to protect us at the workplace and to protect our Social Security and to make us a functioning democracy in the 21st century. And one other thing that I'm going to leave you on, and that is that one of the things I think about a lot, it actually comes from a book, a good friend of mine's book about China, his first book about China. And in it, he argued that the Cultural Revolution was in part because the reimposition of imperial authority after the Taiping Rebellion meant that China did not modernize when it should have, along with all the other countries in the world who kind of went by leaps and fits and backs and starts through the late 19th century and into the 20th, so that when it was time to modernize, China went about it all at once and in really destructive ways. And I've thought a lot, and I'm not saying his name because he might not appreciate that characterization of his first book, but I've thought about that a lot, because in fact, since the rise of Reagan in 1981 and him taking office, America has in fact backed off of so many of the things that we needed to do to modernize to meet the demands of the 21st century. And now, when in fact you compare us, for example, to other European countries or liberal democracies, we're behind on social welfare, we're behind on climate change, we're behind on a social safety net, we're behind on business regulation, we're behind all kinds of places that other people have gone. And now we are in a place, because of the rise of this reactionary Republican minority, which has commandeered the Supreme Court and the Senate, and now members of the House of Representatives. Because of that, we are stopped from moving forward. And one of the things that I would urge us, I won't speak for you, that worries me as I look forward, is that we must modernize or accept our descent into an oligarchy or even authoritarianism that will mark us as no longer a liberal democracy, and one in which a very few people have all the money and all the rights and the rest of us are serfs at best. Either we will do that, or we will go through this wrench that will make us fully functioning a fully functioning liberal democracy in the 21st century. That wrench is going to be really hard, even if you like it, even if you are behind it. It's going to mean breaking a lot of things that people are really accustomed to. And I would urge people to recognize the use of guardrails at a time like this. I saw someone on Twitter today, somebody progressive on Twitter, to say, burn it all down, let's rewrite the Constitution. That is a recipe for the rise of strongmen, for turning everything over to an authoritarian. And while obviously there are many pieces of where our country is that I don't like, I would urge people to recognize that we need guardrails in order to preserve liberal democracy. Because if we turn it into chaos, the answer is not going to be a better, fairer democracy. The answer is going to be, in this moment, an authoritarian. So I worry about that a lot. I want dramatic change to stop our increasing governance by a radical minority. But the degree to which we can preserve our principles of equality before the law, demand for equality before the law, equality of access to resources, and our right to consent to the government under which we live, those guardrails must be preserved, or God help us all. I'm going to go right, and I will urge you to remember that we have 2 years to course correct. After 2 years, if there is a radical Republican in our White House, I do not believe that we can be guaranteed still to have the right to protest, the right to speak up, and the right to vote. So please recognize that the hourglass is not empty yet, but we have about 2 years left. So now is the time. Have faith. I have faith that we can do it in 2 years, but we must recognize that we are not in normal times. Thank you for being here, and I'm going to go right.